Welcome. Thank you all for being here today. It's really great to be here at CypherCon. I thank for the invite and everything, and I'm really excited to tell everybody about the X-15 rocket plane. How many people here already know something about the vehicle? Couple? Cool. Very cool. And I just have to make a special shout out. I'm sorry, Alex or Alec?
Alex.
Alex, yes. He brought the model of the X-15, an old topping model. Really cool, so you get a little look at what it looks like in 3D as well. So thank you very much for bringing that today. So with that, I know we have limited time, so I'll get running here. I'm Michelle Evans, and I'm here to tell you the story of the most amazing experimental rocket plane that ever took to the skies. But more importantly, I want to talk to you about the people who helped fly the first wings into space. And with that, I want to start out with a short excerpt. This is the beginning of Chapter 5 from my book. Eons of hot, dry sun baked the ancient lake bottom to near asphalt hardness, the color bleached to a dirty white. Close up, the surface was crisscrossed with fissures, giving it the look of dragon scales. Seasonal rain repeatedly scoured the top layer smooth. Roughly circular, the dry lake was more than 5 miles across, a perfect oasis of level ground among the scattered hills surrounding the area. Southeast of the silver boom town from the early 1900s of Tonopah, Nevada, the lake was given the inauspicious name of Mud. No vegetation marred the pristine surface. Maybe an occasional lizard, snake, jackrabbit, or coyote might dart across the outer edges, but there was little reason for any living thing to trek across the vastness of that silent interior. All these inhospitable qualities were perfect for one special purpose. On the morning of 9 November 1962, that purpose was fulfilled. The quiet was shattered by a sonic boom. The X-15, with pilot Jack McKay at the controls, had not achieved full thrust after launch, so he needed a place to land. Mud Dry Lake was directly to the east of his flight track. He turned and made for the ground. As he neared touchdown, McKay set the flaps, but they did not respond. His landing was going to be very fast. The rear skid slapped down, followed quickly by the nose gear. Bouncing slightly, the left rear skid failed under the strain. A chain reaction began as the now crippled aircraft went out of control. The left wing and rear stabilizer scraped along the ground, ripping the stabilizer from its mount. The wing continued its slide, pivoting the aircraft and flipping the X-15 over onto its back. As the accident unfolded for McKay, time slowed as his adrenaline kicked in, heightening his test pilot reflexes. Jack sensed the beginning of the flip, instinctively reaching for the canopy jettison switch. He knew if the aircraft went over, he would be trapped inside if it remained in place. The aircraft came to rest on its back as McKay had feared. But with the canopy gone, the weight of the aircraft now transferred directly to Jack's helmet, compressing his neck. He actually lost 3/4 of an inch of height in this accident. A helicopter moved in using its downwash to keep the area clear of fumes from the toxic fuels aboard the stricken rocket plane. Now, it took 9 years to achieve Mach 1, Mach 2, and Mach 3. The last of these took the life of pilot Mel Abt. Gaining speed was a really dangerous business. And yet a winged rocket ship which could double those records in just a few short years went into development, the X-15 rocket plane. Now, Scott Crossfield left the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics to work for North American Aviation to help design, build, and fly the X-15. He's seen here with Ivan Kinchlow from the U.S. Air Force, who was going to be their chief test pilot, and and Joe Walker from NASA, who was their chief test pilot. Unfortunately, Ivan Kinchlow did not survive long enough himself to make it onto the X-15 program. He actually died 2 weeks after the rollout of the X-15 in a really terrible F-104 crash. Now, construction of the North American Aviation Facility near Los Angeles International Airport was kept from prying eyes. Even other people who worked there at North American were not allowed to see. They put a fence up around the X-15, so it was all a need to know at the time. But all that changed on 15 October of 1958. That's just 2 weeks after the NACA was transformed into the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. All the secrecy came down. It was unveiled to the public. Vice President Richard Nixon said that day, "The X-15 is exciting because of the fact that it's designed to carry a man into space for the first time. It is an integral part of an orderly and reasoned space program. These pilots are men to be envied, for theirs will be the ultimate goal toward which men's dreams have stretched for centuries. It's useless for me to cite their bravery. We can only envy them for the opportunity which is theirs." Now, an integral part of the X-15 was the Mc2 Pressure Suit, seen here modeled by Scott Crossfield in a heat facility. They were making sure they could pump up the heat, and he'd do just fine. Now, this suit was created by the David Clark Company. Previous to this, they had been primarily known for one big thing. They constructed ladies' undergarments. This was their first spacesuit. Crossfield once wrote about David Clark, saying, "The structural loads imposed on a girdle, as we all know, can be tremendous. And a machine which can build one automatically is an amazing engineering accomplishment." With his ingenious machine, Clark had all but cornered the important and, shall we say, expanding girdle market. And braving new frontiers, Clark then moved into the manufacture of brassieres, which, considering those structural loads, was even more awesome. This then gave the David Clark Company the proper foundation on which to build America's first spacesuits, and they are still building them today. Now, the cockpit is a very tight fit, as you can see in this fisheye view here. Now, the windows on the X-15, there's two of them on the front. You can see up here, they're only about this big. They're fairly small, but the pilot was right up against it, so we actually had a pretty good view. Now, they prepared for months for the first flight, but the problems kept the X-15 in the hangar or attached to the B-52 mothership. They were thinking this might end up being a hangar queen because it took so many months to get this ready. They finally took it out, fueled it, got it ready, checked it out over and over again. Something would go wrong. They'd have to start all over. But finally, on Monday, 8 June 1959, they achieved the first drop test. They went off the B-52's wing at 8:38 a.m., and Scotty expertly glided the unpowered X-15 toward the Rogers Dry Lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert. As he neared landing, Scotty experienced a near-disastrous pilot-induced oscillation. He was porpoising up and down and up and down, but he was able to expertly touch down right at the bottom of one of those porpoising oscillations, and the first flight was a total success. Scotty had microphones in his face before he could even get out of the cockpit. At the time, everyone truly believed that the X-15 was going to be the vehicle that took the first man into space. Now, the second X-15 soon joined the fleet, making the first powered flight on 17 September of 1959. But rocket engine development was behind schedule, so they installed the XLR-11 engines. These are the same engines that were used to power Chuck Yeager and the X-1 past Mach 1 back in October of 1947. And those LR-11s worked perfectly, and touchdown of the first powered flight. Unfortunately, the third powered flight did not go quite as well as you can see here. Right after launch from the B-52, there was a fire in the engine compartment. It burned through the jettison lines. He shut down and went into the lake bed. Instead of being able to jettison all his fuel, he had to land fully fueled, almost total weight on it. As soon as it touched down, the thing literally broke its back. Luckily, nobody was hurt there, and they were able to take it back down and get it up and running again in a few months. And the number one was still there to continue flight testing, while number two was being repaired back down by LAX. Now, while the initial flight tests continued with the LR-11s, the third X-15 was being prepped with the 60,000-pound thrust rocket engine, which is, yes, shown here on the model here. This is a single-chamber engine, the XLR-99. This is what was made to power the X-15, but it was quite a ways behind schedule. Now, at the propulsion system test facility, they could test out two X-15s at one time, as you can see here in this photograph. There's one down here and another one up here. The thing I want you to really note in this photograph, though, is up here in the corner, there's a little red and white Bonanza up there. That was owned by Scott Crossfield. Scotty's daughter Sally told me, you know, in the X-15 days, he started flying his Bonanza to and from Edwards because we'd moved from Lancaster down to Los Angeles, and having that airplane was the only way that he could get any home time with us. But the powers that be at North American actually didn't like him flying his personal plane through Los Angeles airspace because they thought it was too dangerous. It's a bit ironic for wanting to go out and fly a rocket plane to Mach 6 or flying through LA traffic. Now this is what a successful LR-99 rocket engine test firing should look like in the propulsion system test stand. But on 8 June of 1960, it did not go quite as planned. A valve stuck, causing a fuel explosion, literally blowing the X-15 in half. Scotty was sitting in the cockpit operating the controls. He wasn't in his spacesuit, he was just in a business suit that day. The forward section of the X-15 with him in it was blown 25 feet forward. He experienced over 100 instantaneous Gs. He said at the time that he suffered no major injury from it. When I talked to him, he actually admitted he got detached retina. But you don't tell that to the flight surgeon or you don't fly anymore. And so, of course, the fireman came out to put out the fire, got him out of the cockpit. He was saying, don't take me out of the cockpit. I'm in my safest spot. This thing is made to handle heat, right? But after being hosed down by the fireman, Scotty famously said the headline that day in the paper should read, "Aircraft blows up, pilot wets pants." Now here's one of the few photos showing the first 4 test pilots. You got Forrest Peterson from the Navy, Scott Crossfield from North American, Bob White, who took over from Ivan Kinchlow, who was killed in the Air Force crash of the F-104, and again Joe Walker from NASA. For some reason, they tended to leave Peterson out. The Navy was sort of the also-ran, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So these are the 3 prime pilots here. Now, finally, Scotty had to leave. There was a point when Scotty actually said, you know, I designed this thing. I know the most about this aircraft than anybody. I should fly every single flight there is. And, of course, NASA, who was footing the bill, and Air Force, who was really running the program, said, no, we're paying for this. Please just hand this over, get your flights out of the way, and let's get going. So Crossfield went out and ceremoniously handed over a set of keys to Bob White, and Joe Walker wasn't available that day, so they sent out this other guy you might have heard of, a guy named Neil Armstrong, who was also on the program. He was second backup NASA pilot at that point. Now here's a typical mission profile for the X-15. The X-15 was the very first experimental aircraft to ever leave the local area at Edwards. It required a 400-mile-long corridor known as the High Range, with 2 tracking stations that followed every flight. They had the main station at Edwards, then you go up to Beatty, which is outside of Death Valley, and all the way up to Ely, Nevada. In the northeast corner there, it's 9,300 feet up, and even in the summertime, this is what it can look like. I've actually gone up there in June and got turned back by snow. This is the aftermath of an ice storm up at Ely, and you can tell one of the interesting things here, it looks like the wind was pretty much blowing sideways there. Really not a very hospitable place to be spending your time on the X-15. Now here's a group shot early in the program of the X-15 pilots. The first batch with the primary and the backup got Bob Rushworth, who is the backup to Bob White over here, Jack McKay, who is Walker's primary backup, Armstrong, the second NASA backup, and right in the middle, Forrest Peterson from the Navy again. But first up after Scotty was Joe Walker, and he was a relaxed old country boy from the backwoods of Pennsylvania. And here he is stepping out of the suiting van and heading for the X-15 and dropping away on the first NASA flight in the program on 25 March of 1960. One thing to note here is that NASA wanted to make sure everybody knew who was running the program now that North American was finished, so you can see the nice big yellow NASA emblazoned across that tail. Also notice if you look at the pictures, there's no U.S. Navy ever painted on there. Forrest Peterson had to fly under the banner of NASA and the Air Force. Now also compare the post-recovery requirements for the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs compared to the X-15. Remember, this is the same time that we were flying to the moon in those programs. For the X-15, when it landed on the lake bed, you'd send out a couple of trucks. There's actually a lot more people in this photograph than there normally would be because this is fairly early in the program. But you compare that to the Apollo program, you had to send out an entire naval flotilla. It was a little more cost-effective to be flying the X-15. Now, Joe Walker took the X-15 literally to the heights. On 22 August of 1963, Walker topped out the X-15 program at 354,200 feet. That's 67.1 miles high. It's about 10 times the height of what you fly in a commercial airliner today. With no air, attitude control jets, as shown here in this illustration, were required to keep the aircraft, the rocket plane, properly oriented before a human-controlled re-entry. And here's the curvature of the Earth as seen by the X-15 pilots. Joe's eloquent perspective on his flight that day. The overhead aspect is just like one of these dark velvet cloths as far as the sky's appearance, but there weren't any specks of light shining through that I could pick out. He remarked, "By gosh, it is dark up here today. Quite a different view. What a beautiful day it is." I think I can safely say that out of the 12 pilots on the X-15, Joe seemed to enjoy the flight more than anybody else. He said, you know, you've got a long time where you find yourself having done your looking around and figuring, well, if I'd had more sense, I would have looked around more. But Joe completed his stint on the X-15 and left to become NASA's chief test pilot on the B-70 bomber program. On 8 June 1966, Walker was flying an F-104 as part of a 5-aircraft formation centered on the B-70. His F-104 was asked to slide in tighter for photographs. He's down here in this F-104 with the orange tail on it. The F-104 got caught in the wingtip vortex of the B-70. It flipped it right up over the top of the B-70 and rolled off the back end. Sheared off the 2 tails of the B-70, split the F-104 into 3 pieces, and it blew up. A frantic call of "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" went out over the air. Walker was killed instantly as he rolled across the top of the bomber. The B-70 was also crippled. The guys in the cockpit of the B-70, when they heard the Mayday, they didn't even realize it was about them. That aircraft just kept going on, and it took a while before things started to react and they started going out of control. It was crippled. It went down minutes later, killing co-pilot Carl Cross, who was not able to eject. However, Al White, the pilot, who had also been Scott Crossfield's backup on the X-15 but never had a chance to fly, did survive, although he did have very, very serious injuries. Now, the prime pilot for the Air Force was Bob White, seen here with Joe Walker when the two of them were still on the program together. These 2 guys were the primary record setters on this aircraft. And you can see White in the X-15 out there on the wing of the B-52. He's got his head down, his helmet there, you can see that. He's checking his switch positions, making sure everything is ready for the drop and the very short 10-minute flight to come. That's all it was. Once you dropped off the wing, 10 minutes until you're going to be on the ground somewhere. Bob White was the only man to be the first to surpass 3 Mach numbers. Most of you probably are familiar with Chuck Yeager, first Mach 1. Scott Crossfield was actually the first guy to Mach 2. Mach 3, Mel Apt killed him. Bob White came along, he surpassed Mach 4, 5, and 6, the first. And hardly anybody knows who he is today. Bob told me, you know, I didn't realize until afterward that I was that first Mach 4, 5, and 6. Now, some NASA guy come up and said, hey, wait a minute, we want Joe Walker to break one of these here too. Well, I'm not quite sure what would have happened because the Air Force really, really liked breaking records. Now, White was so proud of his skills as an X-15 pilot, he bet his buddy there, Doug Day, who was one of the ground crewmen, a martini, that he could set the X-15 down within just 1,000 feet of the planned touchdown point. the smoke bomb goes off to give the pilot an indication of the wind as he's coming in. This isn't a bad thing to do when you consider this is the days before digital computers, GPS, and stuff like that, and he's coming back from suborbital space. This is all pilot skill to put it down there, and he won that martini from Doug on almost every one of his 16 flights on the X-15. And after becoming the first pilot in history to ever exceed 300,000 feet in altitude on 17 July 1962, White had to get out quick because he had to go catch a commercial flight across country and head for Washington, D.C., where he was to receive the Collier Trophy with his fellow pilots Crossfield, Walker, and Peterson. President John F. Kennedy that day said, "We're very proud of these 4 young men who are among the finest we have, who took a manned aircraft into space yesterday to over 300,000 feet and 4,000 miles per hour. We're very proud to have them here, not only for what they've done in space, but also because they represent the kind of Americans whom we want this country to be identified with. We hope that their example will encourage others to do something that requires reaching beyond what we now know and what we now do." I want to give you a quick comparison. This is the LR-11 and this is the LR-99. They actually had to stack 2 of these LR-11s on top of each other for a total of 8 rocket chambers in the back of the X-15 to achieve just 16,000 pounds of thrust. One chamber on that XLR-99 achieved 60,000 pounds of thrust. It was a massive technological achievement. It was also throttleable. Originally, it was supposed to be from 30 to 100%. They eventually restricted it to 50 to 100%, but they had a lot of control over that rocket. Here's the twin LR-11s firing on the test stand as configured for the X-15, and the X-15 under power with those LR-11s. The maximum speed achieved in that configuration was Mach 3.5. That's faster than the SR-71, and yet it was nothing. This is only half of what was envisioned for the X-15 with the LR-99. And here's a very impressive single-chamber LR-99 firing on the test stand and installed in the X-15 on the B-52's wing, ready for flight. Now I want to come back to Forrest Peterson. He was the only U.S. Navy pilot who flew the X-15. This is pretty cool here. You got this little thing, somebody painted this shield on the side. He had just gotten promoted from lieutenant commander to commander in the Navy. While serving on the X-15, he was up for this promotion, but to get that, the Navy required him to have 1 year of sea duty. It's a little hard to have when you're out in the Mojave Desert of California, right? But don't worry, they found a way around that. They assigned him up to the Naval Squadron up at China Lake, which is just north of Edwards, but it's also just as landlocked. But they still counted that as sea duty. Peterson told me all they did was assign me up to that squadron up at China Lake, yet I stayed at the same place at Edwards where I'd been through the program. China Lake was just as landlocked as Rogers, but that didn't matter. After a year, I accumulated my sea duty, and they promoted me to commander. And this was cool. Somebody painted this thing on here. I wish somebody had video of the presentation. He came out of the suiting van. Somebody actually had rolled out a red carpet for him. And there was a NASA guy who was an ex-Navy bosun's mate who pulled out his whistle and piped him aboard. And there's a really, really terrible photograph of Peterson. It's just so bad I can't even use it. But you can just tell the expression on his face is like, can I just get out of here and go fly this plane right now? And on 10 January 1962, Peterson made his final flight, which also turned out to be the very first emergency landing outside of Edwards. After landing safely up at Mud Dry Lake near Tonopah, Nevada, which is about 200 miles away, the X-15 then had to be put on the back of a flatbed truck and carted back to Edwards. And of course, it's a long trip, so they needed to stop along the way for gas and some snacks and what have you. This is outside a standard station that was in Beatty, Nevada. That actually just got torn down not too long ago. Peterson had to leave the X-15 in order to resume his naval career. He could have stuck around and continued on the program, but he would have been stifled on his promotions from there on out. He eventually went on to active duty on the Navy, commanding the aircraft carrier Enterprise. I guess you could say he was the original Captain Kirk. He was a really great guy. He used to live in Virginia right across the street from the CIA. Now, Jack McKay is the next pilot up from NASA, and he's seen here with his wife Shirley and daughter Sherry. That's their first child. I say first because they eventually had 8 kids. I don't know what it is about these test pilots. Joe Walker had 6. All these guys had huge families. It's something like, well, I'm going to go out and have a flight. We'll have a kid. I'll go out and do another flight. I don't know. That's a big family. A lot of people. Now, strapped to the mothership's wing, McKay heads for launch altitude on the morning of 9 November of 1962. Things did not go so well, as you might recall from my reading from Chapter 5 at the beginning of this talk. Here is the aftermath of that accident. You can see the shadow of the H-21 helicopter there that was blowing the fumes out of the way. By the time this photograph was taken, they'd already dug him out, and he was on his way to the hospital at Edwards. Operations engineer Bill Albrecht said Jack McKay saved his own life. As soon as he saw it was going to tumble over, he jettisoned the canopy. He was smart enough to think, if I go over and I'm not breathing air, by the time they get here to try to rescue me, I'm going to be dead. Now you can see the massive damage to the X-15. Who wouldn't expect this to be a total loss? It's amazing that McKay even survived. Bill Albrecht continued, my first view of it was from the window of the C-47 Goonie Bird, which took a bunch of us up to Mud Lake. It's a military version of the DC-3. When I saw that thing upside down, I said, that's the end of that airplane. But a steel airplane, that's something else. It's tough stuff. Most fighter planes, you know, they're made out of aluminum, things like that, relatively light. The X-15 was made out of Inconel X, nickel alloy steel. Weighed 50,000 pounds in its final configuration, a very, very heavy aircraft. And although severely injured, 4 months later, McKay returned to the program and accomplished 22 more research flights on the X-15, although he did experience 2 more emergency landings before finally leaving the program in September 1966. You can see this one, he was running off the lake bed at Delamar, and he popped the canopy again just in case he was going to tumble over, but luckily this time he did stay upright. Now McKay was a family man. I told you he had 8 kids. He's seen here with 2 of them up at Red Rock Canyon north of Edwards. Really beautiful area. If you're ever out there, seek it out. Really worth going to. In the end, those injuries in 1962 shortened his life. He died in 1975, 13 years of suffering before he finally died on that. It's terrible. Sherry, his daughter, told me most of the time when there's an accident with a test pilot, they're just killed outright. They aren't hanging around the halls at Edwards as a reminder of what might happen to them. I think my father felt alienated from everyone and everything, and he was just in a tremendous amount of pain. Now, Bob Rushworth was up next, and he became the most successful X-15 pilot out of the 12, accomplishing 34 flights in less than 6 years. Paul Bickle, the head of the X-15 program, related to me that Bob White ran into his office one day, and he said of Rushworth, he's not motivated enough. We asked if he wanted to get onto the X-15 program. He said he had to think about it. Not only that, he said he had to go ask his wife. Can you imagine? And yet he became the most successful pilot out of the 12 guys. Definitely tells you something. And as you can see by this photo, the F-104 and the X-15 are very similar in shape and size. They used the F-104, they could configure it like the X-15 for landing approaches, and they were able to go out there and shoot touch and goes, sometimes up to 200 times before each flight. They never had another landing accident after that one of the McKay flight because of the F-104 program. And after the McKay accident in 1962, remember that mess you saw on the floor of Mud Dry Lake? This is what it looked like about 18 months later. They rebuilt this into what was now called the X-15A2. The biggest thing you notice here is it's got these 2 big external fuel tanks on there. Regularly, you'd fly this thing, you'd light off the engine, you got about 90 seconds of engine thrust. After that, you were a parabolic glider. With those things added, you got an extra 60 seconds of thrust, another 2/3 time on thrust. They were really pushing They were hoping to get up to Mach 8 on this thing. The aircraft was actually also extended a total of 29 inches. It was really a great show. And with those tanks in place, as I say, they were shooting for up to Mach 8. And like the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle, the tanks could be jettisoned about Mach 2. On Rushworth's final flight in the program, it was the first flight with those fuel tanks full. But El Cheapo transducers, as flight planner Johnny Armstrong told me, misread the fuel flow. Everything was working fine, but the fuel flow was showing negative. So they erroneously jettisoned the fuel tanks and made another emergency landing back to Mud Lake. Now here we are about the middle of the program, and some of the pilots on at this point. We got Jack McKay, who is now the prime pilot for NASA. Joe Walker literally just at the moment, so he was leaving the program. Milt Thompson is now McKay's backup for NASA, and Bob Rushworth, the prime pilot after Bob White left, and his new backup, Joe Engle. And Joe Engle, I'm very proud to say, is also the person who wrote the foreword for my book. He is also the only one of the 12 pilots who is still with us today. Really great guy here. And not shown in this photograph, he was out that day, was a guy named Neil Armstrong, who was also getting ready to fly the X-15. Seen here sitting in the cockpit, does he, look like he's about 12 or something? He always looked like he was so young. This is like Dad take me to work day or something, is what it looked like. Wonderful guy. It was really a shock to lose him so many years ago. I was always proud. He and I actually shared a birthday, which was cool. He was 25 years older than I was, but I'm catching up to him now. And here's Armstrong with a couple of X-15 engineers, John McTeague and Elmore Adkins. It's sort of hard to see with the lights on here, but you can see the X-15 up above them here. The landing gear for the nose gear is still down. They actually have to push that up manually and get it locked in place, so it's hanging on the B-52 wing, getting ready for flight. And here he is leaving the suiting van and heading out for the rocket plane and ready to go on a drop. Now, Roger Barnicky, he worked on the life support systems, that pressure suit that we talked about. He said, I watched them get ready for a flight, and they'd come back and they just have the biggest grin on their faces. They were doing something they loved, and it really showed how much they enjoyed flying. This was their life. There wasn't one of them that didn't give me that impression. Of course, I had to ask him, well, what if the pilot screwed something up on the flight? Maybe it's something his fault. Well, then they were kind of quiet, but they didn't hide things. That was dangerous. And Neil screwed up on several occasions. You might not think this about the first guy to land on the moon, but he had a flight where he skipped back up out of the atmosphere because he wasn't paying attention to what he was doing. Almost had to land down at LAX. Almost crashed an F-104 one time while checking out a dry lake bed for an upcoming flight on the X-15 to make sure it could hold up after some rains because he couldn't judge his altitude correctly. This is what the aftermath of that little incident looked like. Paul Bickle described the scene to me. He said, Neil realized what he'd done, so he firewalled the F-104. While the engine was picking up speed, the ship kept getting lower and lower. He dragged one of the tip tanks off, dragged the ventral off the tail, released the arrestor hook back in the back. It also tore out one of the hydraulic systems and the radio antenna, which left him without any radio, only emergency hydraulics and red lights flashing all over the place. If you know the F-104, the landing gear comes down from the center like this. It was literally getting pushed back up. This is how low he got before he finally started picking up speed. Continuing, Bickle said he knew he had problems, but he didn't know what was going on, so he figured he'd make a flaps-up landing at Nellis Air Force Base over near Las Vegas. But this hook is hanging out the back. He snagged the arresting chain on the approach end of the runway at 220 knots. Just tore the chain right out of the runway. His airplane went down the runway, dragging all this junk, blew his tires out. Nellis was tied up for 3 hours just getting the runway cleaned off. Then Milt Thompson comes up from Edwards. He goes up in a two-place F-104B to bring Neil back down, and he overshot the runway and blew his tires off, tying the thing up again. The aerodrome officer called me and he said, "Hey, Paul, please do not send any more of your pilots up here. We'll load your guys on one of our planes and bring them back to you." It was a disgraceful display all around. Paul was actually talking about firing Neil. Instead, Neil put his application into the astronaut office and was accepted, got him away from Edwards, and the rest is history. Now, early in Joe Engle's career, he got to serve as a docent during a visit from Vice President Hubert Humphrey. "I was a new guy in the program. Bob Rushworth's my boss, and he says, 'You're going to go down to the hangar, you're going to stand by the X-15. Just stand there, you won't have to say anything.' Humphrey came up and he said, 'Well, what have we here?' Scared the hell out of me. I didn't know how to talk to a guy like that. But Joe recovered quickly, saying to Humphrey, 'Well, it's the X-15, sir.' The vice president thought a moment, then said, 'Oh, yes. Now, how many squadrons of these do we have?' Engle wasn't quite sure what to say, but he replied, 'Well, not very many, sir.' Humphrey replied, 'Well, we need more of these, obviously. I'll fix that when I get back to Washington.'" I don't know, do 3 aircraft make a squadron? I guess, yeah. Now, Engle went on to fly 3 astronaut qualification flights on the X-15, seeing the Earth from more than 280,000 feet above the southwest, as seen here. This is Las Vegas, Nevada down here with Lake Mead heading up that way. They had a pretty amazing view. And here's what a dramatic entry from suborbital space would look like on the X-15. Of course, you can't actually get up there and take pictures of this. One of the things you've noticed in here is I've had some artist illustrations. These were all done by a guy named Tommy Erickson. He also did the cover of the book. Got to give a shout out to Tommy. He just did magnificent work. He and I worked together for over 6 years creating the images, getting them just right for the book, and he just did a wonderful job. He lives over in Göteborg, Sweden, and just a fantastic artist. He actually did his PhD dissertation and used a lot of his work on this program for the X-15 to earn his PhD. So now he's Dr. Tommy Erickson. Great guy. Now, many others were also excited about the X-15. Even as astronauts were preparing to fly Apollo to the moon, Wernher von Braun came by at Edwards and jumped into the cockpit so he could see what it might be like to fly wings into space. And here's Miss Edwards, 1962, Wanda Capps, who gets a lift from the wing of the X-15. And how about the cast and crew from the TV show Star Trek that was filming at the time? They came up and see what the real deal was all about. And the X-15 is often considered a man's program, but it should never be forgotten that many women worked on it as well. They were primarily called computers, and they took all the data that came down from these flights, and they plotted it out for the engineers using Frieden calculators, paper, and pens. And without the women, the X-15 data that was achieved meant absolutely nothing. Now, like Neil, Joe left for Houston, was initially assigned as the lunar module pilot for Apollo 17, which was to be the 6th moon landing. Unfortunately, 18, 19, and 20 all got canceled, and the politicians really wanted to put an actual scientist onto the moon, and Joe lost his slot to land on the moon to Harrison Smith, the geologist. But he stuck with the program. So after getting bumped from Apollo, Joe was able to finally fly 2 missions on the space shuttle. He was commander on STS-2 in November of 1981 and STS-51I in 1985. Joe is the only astronaut in history who earned his astronaut wings prior to going into orbit because of his 3 suborbital flights on the X-15. Anybody out there know, take one guess where he was born?
Milwaukee?
No, Kansas. Yes, Kansas. Yes, yeah, he was born right in the dead center of the country. Now, Mel Thompson was a man that was torn between 2 flight test programs, and he also got to be NASA's technical advisor on the very first movie ever filmed in outer space. Anybody ever seen this movie? X-15. Great flick. Most people hate it, but it's still fun. It's narrated by Jimmy Stewart, produced by Frank Sinatra. It was pretty cool. It's got some really, really great footage in it. The story is pretty hokey, but the film footage is really worth it. Milt recalled being involved for approximately 3 months. I think they were here on site probably a couple of months, and after that we went down and spent a month in Hollywood during the cutting process. Well, of course, I had to ask him, well, did you have any input on how to make the film better? Oh yeah, a lot of stuff. It was completely wrong on so many things. They really did not understand airplanes at all. The guy that wrote the script had apparently never even been around an airplane, which was actually true. Star of the show, a guy named Charles Bronson. It was his first big starring role. He's seen here with Bob White. And also in her first big screen role, Mary Tyler Moore, who shows us the proper fashion sense to be out there amongst rocket planes wearing her high heels out on the desert. But the hype did not end there. Here's a couple scenes from another movie called Battle in Outer Space. Anybody see this movie? It's worth seeking out. It's really cool. It's even available on Blu-ray now. Remember those squadrons of X-15s from Hubert Humphrey? Well, obviously they got put into service battling aliens trying to take over the Earth here. This is so cool. You've got these silo launch and gantry launch and all these. So they're silver X-15s. They had red racing stripes on the wings. They were so cool. And of course, what X-15 is not complete without a death ray in the nose, right? Now, people forget how popular the X-15 was at the time it was flying. It was used to advertise a company's participation in this high-flying program, or maybe somebody might want to call their product, say, the Kodak Instamatic X-15. There is a camera in this photo, just want to make sure I have that camera too. Yes. And besides film and advertising, there were many books. Several of the people, like Scott Crossfield, wrote their own memoirs and stuff. They also had, for young readers, the fictional adventures of Mike Mars. These are really fun. There's a whole series of books. 2 of them had to do with the X-15. Mike Mars Flies the X-15, and the follow-up, Mike Mars South Pole Spaceman. They actually took the X-15 out and we're going to fly it over Antarctica so they could fly up through the gaps in the magnetic field to launch a Blue Scout rocket. And of course those pesky Soviets at the time wanted to steal all the secrets, and when he landed he was able to blow up the X-15 and push it into a crevasse, so it saved America. So yeah, lots of fun stuff. And here's a really cool X-15 runaround friction toy. As OCD as I am about the X-15, even I didn't buy this. This went for over $900 on eBay. And in 2006, the post office actually commemorated the X-15 with 2 postage stamps issued here. And I'm sorry I don't have 3D glasses for everybody, but it's actually 3D. It's really neat. But it's not something you go out and buy a whole bunch of. This is the cheap one, $4.05 in 2006. The other one was $14.95. Very expensive stamps. But the X-15 was worth it. After 14 flights and a chance at Hollywood, Thompson finished on the X-15. He said, it was busy on those altitude flights. I really only got the chance to look out the window one time, and that was on my final flight. I got up on top after I had everything fairly settled. I looked out the window. Gee, it was a really impressive view. You could see all the way from San Francisco down to Baja, California. It was beautiful up there, but you only have a few precious seconds to take a look. Now, Milt was the first to fly the lifting body type. Everybody here familiar with the $6 Million Man? You see those opening credits, he's out there tumbling, and that's what screws him up. That's the vehicle right there, the M2F2. That's the one that they used the crash footage of. It was not Milt Thompson who crashed that day. It was another guy named Forrest Peterson, and he actually came out a lot better than the fictional Steve Austin did. He did lose an eye in that accident, but it was actually because of an infection in the hospital, not the accident itself. But Milt was the first to fly this vehicle, and he was given a choice by Paul Bickle. He said, you know, you're flying the X-15, you're flying the lifting bodies, you got to choose one over the other. And contrary to what you might think, he actually decided to go with the lifting bodies over the X-15. Now, Pete Knight was about to become the fastest man alive. His program was at X-15A2 with the external fuel tanks I showed you before. This is the programming inherited from Bob Rushworth. Pete made 16 flights on the X-15. One of them is considered the most famous while another was probably one of the most dangerous. The program built up speed, testing out the capabilities with the external tanks. But also one primary purpose of those high-speed flights was to test a scramjet engine, that supersonic combustion scramjet. This is a dummy model of one mounted to the bottom of the X-15. And after years of work, it never came to fruition, and it's only recently been tested using unmanned vehicles at hypersonic velocity. And before continuing with the A2 on a routine flight in aircraft number 1, Pete launched, and soon afterward, all electrical power in the rocket plane died. No one knew where he was, or even if he was still alive. For all they knew, the aircraft just blew up. Knight told me I was a little over Mach 4, and the airplane was wallowing around. I still had reaction jets, so I maintained some control. At one time, I was up over about a 70-degree bank angle, and I looked down and I saw Mono Lake. I told myself, you better enjoy that view because that's probably the last view you're ever going to have. It was going to hurt regardless of what I did. If I bailed out, I was over Mach 4. That's the limit on the ejection seat. So I thought, well, I'll stay with it. I'll see what happens, see how long I can control it. Once I lose it, then I'll bail out. As the aircraft went over the top, I started up an auxiliary power unit. It at least gave me hydraulics so I could control the re-entry. I didn't have any instruments. There were no lights in the cockpit. As I entered the atmosphere, I turned around, pulled about 6 Gs to get back to Mud Lake. I didn't have any flaps. All I had was airspeed and altitude once I went subsonic. Now, something you have to understand is the X-15, when it's launched and it's heading back toward Edwards, part of the flight plan is they're saying if you have any problems, like between 0 and 60 seconds, you go to this lake. 60 to 70 seconds, you go to the next lake. There's this whole string of lake beds all the way down to Edwards so they could land wherever they needed to land. This electrical short happened right on the break point between Mud Lake and Grapevine Lake. And everybody at the NASA control room saying, oh, well, he's just going to continue flying forward to Grapevine. Pete hated Grapevine, so he turned around and went back to Edwards. NASA's out there sending their aircraft up, trying to find him at Grapevine, and there's nothing there, which really got him all upset because it's like he's really gone. Somebody said, I think it was Bill Dana, another X-15 pilot, said, maybe we should go check Mud. As they went up there, and sure enough, Pete was just sitting there on Mud Lake. He was doing just fine. And once they arrived, Pete was flown back to Edwards, and the X-15 was made ready for yet another convoy back to base. Now, made to protect the X-15A2 at speeds of up to Mach 8, they put on this, it's a sprayed-on Martin ablator. It had the consistency of a pencil eraser, and as you can see in this photograph, it also had the same color. But this stuff was very, very oxygen sensitive, which is not a good thing to have around rocket engines, right? So if you get some liquid oxygen or something would soak into that stuff and some poor mechanic drops a wrench or a hammer or something, it will literally explode. And as Knight explained very vehemently to me, it's pink. I'm not going to fly a pink airplane. So they added a white paint layer to the top, and it was now safe to come back and give a nice little friendly pat to the X-15. And here's something I really love. This is North American Aviation's two white beauties, the XB-70 bomber and the X-15A2 rocket plane. They renamed the X-15 into the White Knight in honor of Pete Knight. It was 2:31 in the afternoon on 3 October 1967 when Pete dropped away from the B-52 with a fully loaded, ablative-covered X-15A2. He leveled off at 102,100 feet and made his speed run, topping out at Mach 6.70, 4,520 miles an hour. That's like coast to coast in a half hour. Unbeknownst to him, though, the aircraft was in peril as shock waves were burning through the X-15 skin. Now, I don't know if we have any engineers here in the audience, but it seems pretty obvious to me. You have this dummy ramjet down here. At Mach 6.7, think of where those shock waves are going, right straight up into the engine compartment. It was really stupid. And so it was literally burning into the engine. But he didn't know any of that was going on. And after landing, the damage was clear. They had almost lost the X-15. It was like a blowtorch in there. This aircraft would never fly again. He used to say if he'd known this was going to be the final flight of the A2, he would have pushed to get that Mach 7 out of it, get one more Mach number. If he'd done that, he probably would have lost the aircraft, and we would have lost Pete. And for surviving that high-speed flight, Knight was awarded the Harmon Trophy by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Bill Dana was the last of the NASA pilots to come onto the program, and the best way he found to get used to flying at Mach 6 and 300,000 feet was to sit in the hangar and fly what they called the Iron Bird simulator, seen here. You could sit down, have your coffee, and talk to the guys while flying like you were up in the outer atmosphere. And here's a shot I really love. This is back during the program when the X-15s were flying. You've got all three X-15s here. You've got all the lifting bodies lined up, HL-10, M2F2, M2F1, an F4 test bed, this orange one. I don't know if you can see it well with the lighting and stuff. That was an F5D Skylancer that was being used for the X-20 pilot training. Unfortunately, the X-20 never flew. And then a mundane old C-47 Goonie bird there on the end. This is the way the hangar looked when I was a kid. When I first went up to Edwards when I was like 5 years old and my daddy took me up there. This is why I got excited about the X-15. This is so far from what this place looks like today. This hangar is primarily empty most of the time. And here's an unexplained Band-Aid on Dana's nose the day prior to his first flight. I asked him what happened, but he refused to tell me. I don't know, maybe he got into an altercation with the simulator or something. He never would tell me what happened that day. But by this time in the program, the X-15 carried experiments rather than being the experiment itself. This image shows the X-15 as it's never been shown before, working in space with instruments deployed. Solar spectrum, missile launch, signature detection, high-altitude balloon deployment, or Bill's favorite, and I say this a little sarcastically, collecting micrometeorite dust. Dana said, I remember there was this big meteor shower. To get out here to Edwards for that early flight, I had to drive out to work in the dark. I have never ever seen so many shooting stars in my life. There must have been 1,000 as I came in from Lancaster. And those were the micrometeorites they were going to send me up to try to capture. I always thought what a classically dumb idea it was in the first place. So of course I had to ask him, well, what if you capture a micrometeorite, say, through the cockpit window rather than out here on the wingtip pod as you're supposed to? He was a little quiet, but he said, well, I don't suppose it would have hurt us. And he was right. Bill survived his high-altitude experiment flights just fine. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the 12th and final X-15 pilot, Michael J. Adams from the United States Air Force. After being accepted as an astronaut into the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, he saw the writing on the wall that they were never going to fly. So he transferred over to the X-15, where he flew 6 successful missions, up until the morning of 15 November 1967, less than 6 weeks after the high-speed flight of Pete Knight. Launching at 10:30 a.m., Mike headed upward into space, topping out at 266,000 feet, earning him a set of astronaut wings. But electrical problems distracted him. At the top of his arc, he misread an instrument and actually turned the X-15 backward along its flight path before re-entering the atmosphere. As the air bit into the rocket plane, the orientation sent him into a hypersonic spin, which knocked him out. Mike came to long enough to grab the controls, but the aircraft went into a severe up and down porpoising motion that exceeded the structural limits of the aircraft. It broke apart at about 64,000 feet, and the pieces fell near Ridgecrest, California, about 10:35 a.m., just 5 minutes after he dropped off the wing. Bob White told me, I often felt that sometimes we went too far with these things. When I was participating in the program, your eye was always on the ball. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this as routine thing. Boy, this is not routine stuff. That NASA is a different NASA than the one that I operated with. A memorial created by Eagle Scout John Badelsky in 2004 now marks the spot in the desert where Mike Adams lost his life. And it has been greatly expanded over the years. It's pretty amazing out there. If you ever get out to the Ridgecrest area in California, it's definitely worth a visit. After the accident, the X-15 was flown by Knight and Dana 8 more times over the coming year before coming to a close with the final flight on 24 October of 1968. With a total of 199 flights, the hope was to have a nice round even 200 before the end of the year when the funding stopped. The last of 8 attempts was made on 20 December with all systems operational. Pete Knight was in the suiting van near the X-15 ready to board for the B-52 takeoff roll. The clouds opened up and we got a freak snowstorm out in the desert. Paul Bickle got on the comm and he said, "We're aborting this flight. Somebody up there is trying to tell us something." And the X-15 program was officially completed. The number 1 X-15 was shipped off to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. Number 2 went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Here's 7 pilots for the Air Force and 3 from NASA that earned astronaut wings. The Air Force took care of their own at the time that it happened, but it took until 2005 for NASA to recognize the achievements of Walker, McKay, and Dana. Bill Dana was the only one left alive at the time to receive his wings. What could have come next? A possible Delta wing variant, but that disappeared after the Adams accident, since number 3 was slated for that program, or a scramjet-powered model, the true follow-on to the X-15, something which has never materialized in the nearly half a century since the program was completed. No manned X-plane may ever again do what the X-15 accomplished. No more testing our limits, no new frontiers to achieve. I hope that maybe the story of the X-15 and the people who made it happen may instead inspire a new generation to take flight into the quest for the unknown. The pilots of the X-15 and I bid you a good day. Thank you, everyone here at CypherCon, for being here. Thank you for having me. And we'll clear out here, and I hope that everybody will come up. I'll be glad to answer questions, and I've got a few copies of my book left that I will be glad to help you with up at registration. Thank you all for being here.
All right.